right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be president of Bismarck State College, and I certainly want to welcome all of you on this balmy North Dakota day. Just delighted that so many people have shown up here to participate in this conversation today. I normally have a long introduction for my good friend here, but sometimes we dispense with that, so we're going to dispense with that today. But please welcome to our stage Clay Jenkinson.
Can I just say a word here, Larry? First of all, thank you so much for coming out today. I know it's a big day in NFL football, and it's snowing, and it's not the best day, but just this sets up the beginning of our conversation, because you and I have been going back and forth about this for a couple of weeks now, and one of the things we want to talk about is why Custer is so attractive, why the fascination with Custer is as large as it continues to be, 140 years after the battle, and the size of today's audience is an example of the fascination that people feel towards George Armstrong Custer. So that's one thing. Secondly, I want to say that I'm kind of nervous because I know for a fact that there are half a dozen people in this audience who know infinitely more about this than you and I do.
Together.
Combined. And so I'm just deferring to you. Go ahead and explain. But Tracy Potter's here. We're going to ask him to come up after a little while to talk for a minute or two. But there are people here who know, it's like Lewis and Clark, and it's like Civil War battlefields and Custer. There are a handful of stories in American life that attract people who give their lives to knowing exactly where each soldier fell and what kind of a gun he wore, and so good luck. And some of them are here.
Yes. A couple announcements before we get into this. First, I do want to thank Tracy for being here. Tracy is the executive director of the Fort Abraham Lincoln Foundation, and I know that he's one of those individuals Clay was just talking about that knows far more about this than us combined. There's certainly no doubt about it. I want to thank Ken Rogers of the Bismarck Tribune. If you got this facsimile of the front page from 1876, Ken was very instrumental in getting us that page, and so we ran that off, and it's got a little timeline on the back of it with, as already been pointed out, some typographical errors. Those are all Mr. Jenkinson's errors. There's a bibliography that, actually Clay put this bibliography together. It was out here at the front table. We ran out of copies. You have overwhelmed us here with your numbers today. We've run out of copies, but Robin assures me that she will get some more run off. So if you didn't get a copy of the bibliography on your way out, again today, they will be available. I also, when you came in, hopefully you picked up, and if you didn't, please pick it up on the way out. There's a little survey card that asks, what you liked about this program, what you didn't like about this program, suggestions for improvement, so on and so forth. This program is in part funded by the North Dakota Humanities Council. Brenna Doherty is the executive director of that. We certainly appreciate their support of our ongoing conversations that we've been having. But one of our requirements is that we turn those in, the surveys, and let them know how the public has responded to what we're doing. So please take just a couple of minutes to fill those out, and there will be a basket for you to put them in when you get out there. Then, it's sort of moving into the program right now. Clay and I were talking as we were watching folks move in here. We sort of thought we might have 12 or 20 or 24 or whatever, and the number just keep growing. I think we could have a session on Mother Teresa, and we wouldn't end up with as many people here. We know for a fact that there, as Clay's already indicated, there's a lot of emotion, and there's a lot going on with George Armstrong Custer that just sort of does not meet the eye immediately. And we're going to start with just a quote here, if I can, because it'll put it all in the right perspective. And so what we want to do is we don't want to look like the Italian Parliament today, throwing chairs and slugging each other and doing all that sort of stuff. But we do know that when you talk about George Armstrong Custer, there's a lot of emotions. There's people that think that he's a villain and, sort of Satan incarnate. There's other people that think he's a wonderful military officer and figure, and so there's going to be all sorts of emotions on both sides of that. So we're just going to have a very civil conversation here, unlike our political landscape that we see play out. We're just going to have a civil conversation, I think, about Custer. I'd like to start off just by just making a point about Custer. I used to teach a little bit about Custer at the Air Force Academy when I was on the faculty there. And I was sort of the lone guy that taught. There was only, I think, 3 of us at the Air Force Academy actually taught American history. Everybody else taught military history, which makes sense. It's a military academy. But I will tell you that military historians in that environment thought that Custer was a non-player in the broad scheme of American military history. That the battle was absolutely insignificant. They would go through the Revolutionary War, maybe a little bit on 1812, the Civil War, and then might even touch World War I, but really got into World War II and then subsequent wars since then. They believe, Clay, that the whole play out of the Indian Wars and what we call Custer's Last Stand, or more appropriately, the Battle of Little Bighorn, was absolutely insignificant in American history. So we had to sort of fight for our little space at the academy so that the cadets down there were exposed to Custer at all, because in the broad scheme of military history, they just didn't figure that he was that important of a figure. So that sort of lays the landscape to it. But I think we ought to get into it, and we'll start talking about why this guy can bring out all these good folks on a Sunday afternoon.
Well, one way to look at that would be to say, if Custer had never been born, how would things have been different? Now, we know that he was a dashing and courageous Civil War commander who took extraordinary risks and was only injured once during the Civil War and very slightly. But the Civil War would have come out the same way whether or not Custer had ever been born, although he played a significant role at several key battles. What we're calling the Indian Wars, the wars of dispossession of Native Americans in the American West, particularly the Great Plains of Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Montana, would have probably played themselves out about the same way if Custer had never been born. And so the people at the Academy, I'm sure, are right in a macro sense that the larger struggles that Custer was a part of were going to come out about the same way with or without him. So then the question becomes, what is the Custer fascination? And the other night, we just sat for about an hour together and made nominations of what are the elements that, if you remove them, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So go ahead and nominate one.
Well, I think one of them that we agree on is George Armstrong Custer, as you've already indicated, his flamboyance. An individual designed his own uniforms. One of his contemporaries said that when he showed up with his own uniforms during the Civil War that he looked like a circus rider. It's kind of ironic. Uniform, the implication is you're all going to look the same. A uniform, right? And Custer had a way of dressing very flamboyantly and showing up in a uniform that was not uniform. It was his own particular design, the red kerchiefs and all that sort of stuff.
But there was more latitude for officers to determine their own dress at that time than there would be today.
Yeah. But I think to begin with, we've got to acknowledge that the flamboyance of George Armstrong Custer, the fact that he believed in this thing, and I know we're going to talk more about this, is Custer luck, the incredible risks that he took during the Civil War, and all of that, just the personage himself. If you would remove Custer and put Terry at the Little Bighorn,
or Crook,
for example,
or
Crook,
Nelson Miles,
or any of those others, I think we would have a very different view of the whole thing. And he had published, not all generals have published, he'd published some books that were fairly well received, even in his time. I think so I think to begin with, the reason that all you folks are here, I think one of the reasons is that the Little Bighorn, it was George Armstrong Custer. We could have the same results at the battle, but if it had been somebody that hadn't been as flamboyant as Custer, I don't think we'd be sitting here talking about it today.
And you could make very, very long lists of his dramatizations, his flamboyance, his risk-taking, his hair, his clothing, the way he posed for photographs. But I'll give you a couple, and then maybe you do. One of the things that's fascinating about Custer is that he nearly missed the two most important battles of the Indian Wars for him. He nearly missed the battle at the Washita down in Oklahoma because he had been court-martialed for being AWOL from Fort Hays in 1867. And he was guilty of the court-martial, and he was suspended for a year. But when it became important to protect the Kansas railroads and Kansas settlements, his superiors specifically asked for him, and he was then allowed to return to his command in the 7th Cavalry before that year-long mandatory furlough was up. And so he nearly missed the Washita, which was the battle, his first great Indian battle, and the one that made him a national figure because of the breathtaking way in which he performed in that battle. And then he nearly missed the Little Bighorn too, because he had been asked he was a Democrat and the Grant administration was Republican, and he had been asked by Congress to testify about corruption in the War Department, provisioning of soldiers and so on in the West. And he was in Washington, D.C. for an extended period in the spring of 1876, and he testified before Congress, largely based on hearsay and not very significant evidence, but he implicated President Grant's own brother Orville, among others, and Secretary Belknap. And for this, Grant flew into a rage about Custer's insubordination and Custer's lack of actual evidence and his willingness to be a political pawn. And so he had Custer arrested in Chicago and planned to deny him a role in the campaign of 1876. And only when General Terry interceded with his superiors and with President Grant did Grant reluctantly acquiesce and allow Custer to go out to Fort Lincoln, but not as the commander of the expedition, but only as the commander of the 7th. And Terry then would lead the group from Fort Lincoln. So the two great battles of his military career in the West, Washita in 1868, and the Little Bighorn in 1876, he very nearly missed because of this quality that he had of not being a particularly reliable military officer within the ranks of hierarchy and so on. And here's another quick, well, go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say on those 2 points, and particularly that last one, I think two of the really misnomers of the Little Bighorn, I think, in the public is that Custer was the commander, which he was not.
He was the subordinate to Terry.
He was subordinate to Terry. And that he was a general, which he was not.
He was a lieutenant colonel. He had been a brevet general.
Brevet general during the Civil War. In fact, 23 years old, he became a general, very young general, during the Civil War because of his conduct there. But after the war, then when he comes back into the service, he comes back as a lieutenant colonel. So those are the two of the big things I think that people misunderstand.
But it was a courtesy, just as we would call Bill Clinton President Clinton, right, or Ed Schaefer Governor Schaefer. It was a courtesy to continue to call people by their highest rank.
And I don't think anybody questioned when the campaign began that if the firing started, it wasn't going to be Terry that was going to be leading the charge. It would be George Custer.
But here we are on the brink of just losing the whole day to talk about Custer. Yeah. Let's not do that. So one reason for the Custer battle fascination is Custer himself.
Custer himself.
All right, and we could go on endlessly in that line. Mm-hmm. Here's a second one. It's the centennial. It's 1876. It is the centennial of the birth of the United States. After the Civil War, there was a feeling of national reconciliation then that we were finally moving forward again. The Industrial Revolution had a greater impact on America than on any other country, with the possible exception of England. The dynamo, there were centennial events all over the country. This news broke in the East, as you see from the Bismarck Tribune, at about the time of the centennial of the United States. And so it could not have been a more unfortunate irony that this debacle on the plains of Montana occurred in this moment of intense national pride on our centennial following the successful completion of the Civil War. You'll accept that as a reason?
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
I think another one, besides the time, I think Elizabeth Custer is really important here because she becomes, and I think 1933 is when she dies.
At the age of 90.
At the age of 90. So she spends her entire life from 1876 to 1933. That's a long time. She spends the rest of her life
57 years
promoting her husband, her dead husband.
Protecting and promoting him
as well. And you know, not everybody has a spouse that's going to do that for 57 years. You know.
Or even 57 weeks.
Yeah.
But she, I mean, she literally gave the rest of her life to the protection, resurrection, and promotion of her husband's greatness. And in some of the books that I've been reading to prepare for this, officers and enlisted men who knew Custer did not publish damning anecdotes and reports about him during her lifetime out of respect to her. But she lived for 57 years after the event, and so she outlasted everybody. Mm-hmm. And by outlasting everybody, she effectively put a suppression on what might have been a much more rigorous and robust debate about Custer in the decades that followed. So if ever a controversial man was lucky in the wife that he chose, not only from the point of view of her longevity, but from her fierce protection of his reputation, it was George Custer, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. One of the points as a historian that always amazes me is that we think about her death in 1933. There is a tendency, I think, to think of this stuff as sort of ancient history, that this happened a long, long time ago. But there are people in this room right now that were alive when Libby Custer died. I heard one of them laugh. And so it's amazing to me that this is not ancient history. This is pretty current history. But anyway, go ahead.
So what have we got so far? Custer, and way to take an easy one. Elizabeth Bacon Custer, his wife, and the Centennial. Give us another one.
I don't know, what did we say that?
Well, I think we said that, for example, there were no survivors from his immediate command. And so the fact that it was a debacle, that it was a massacre, that it was that he was wiped out, makes it fundamentally different from a battle like, take the Rosebud, the Battle of the Rosebud, which occurred just a short time before that with George Crook. It's regarded now as a defeat for the United States Army. It really was a kind of a draw, but it showed that the Indian resistance was much more systematic and fierce than had been anticipated. That story is virtually unknown outside of Custer circles because it didn't end in a complete debacle. So wouldn't you say the fact of the total wipeout of Custer and his immediate command is one source of the mystique?
Absolutely. Because there are other commands that are wiped out too. I know during the Seminole War, and during
the War for the Ohio Valley, there are lots of these.
Yeah, during Washita, there was it Lieutenant Elliott, I think.
Well, that's one small portion.
One small portion. So that does happen. I think another thing that we have to consider are two of the Indian leaders that were there. Number one is Sitting Bull, and all the mystique around Sitting Bull, and then number two is Crazy Horse, and all the mystique that's around Crazy Horse.
Yeah, they
were also part of why this is so important.
Crazy Horse is an Ogallala who is, at the time of this battle, is 31 or 32 years old. Sitting Bull is a Hunkpapa, and at this time he's in his 50s. And Sitting Bull did not participate in the battle itself, but he played an enormous role in sort of the spiritual background to the battle. And he then survived until 1890 and talked about it many times in different contexts. But Crazy Horse was killed just a year and a couple of months later. He was killed at Fort Robinson. But here's why they're important for two reasons. First of all, they're both part of the Lakota Nation. When we normally say Sioux, but the Lakota people. And so they're a subset of the Lakota mystique. The Lakota have a place in the American imagination that's not held by the Crow or the Shoshone or the Iroquois. There's a certain when you think of the Great Plains, when you think of the Indian Wars, you think of nomadic horse riding teepee warrior culture, and that invariably puts you in the Lakota Sioux world or in the Cheyenne world. And so there's a Lakota mystique, and two of the Lakota are two of the best known Indians in American history, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And so that's one reason why that's an important element of this, that this wasn't a fight against, say, the Flatheads or the Nez Perce. The second thing about this is that, and we were talking about this the other night, Larry, that Crazy Horse really masterminded the success of the Indians at the Little Bighorn. And in doing so, he broke with a habit, a tradition of Indian warfare. Can you explain that a little?
Well, let's actually go back to the Rosebud. I think one of the, and not to spend a lot of time on the Rosebud, but just, again, there's a number of folks that know about the Battle of the Rosebud, but, you know, I think we ought to look at that map here. At the Battle of Rosebud, what happens is Crook is coming from the south, and the Lakota and the Cheyenne actually meet him in battle and turn him back. And it's, in my mind, it's one of the first times that we see a major confrontation by the Plains Indians against... Yeah. Did you figure it out?
We're going back to the old method.
Very good.
Let's just use... That's not the one you want, though, is it?
Oh, this is the one we want.
All right, great.
Oh, my.
Keep talking, Larry.
So, this may be our saving grace here. But at any rate, the point is that Crazy Horse then leads the Lakota and Cheyenne against Crook, and they turn around, and Crook ends up turning around and goes fishing, ends up going back to Sheridan, Wyoming to lick his wounds. And that's why he's not up near the Little Bighorn when Custer gets there.
But the difference in strategy.
The important point is that typically the Plains warriors fought very individualistically. And when they went into battle as individuals. Crazy Horse figured out, however, that to defeat the white soldiers, the bluecoats, you had to meet them with a direct tactic. And so he does that, and he does it again at the Little Bighorn. And if we ever get our maps up here, we'll show you that. So he does it again with the Little Bighorn. So that's what I think Clay's alluding to relative to Crazy Horse.
Right, so what Crazy Horse did, Crazy Horse had learned from a lot of experience of how white people fight, and what he realized was that the highly individualistic method of sort of racing around and charging in and having a personal approach to these battles wasn't going to work, and that he needed to discipline his soldiers, and they needed to be a phalanx, and they needed to go around the ends of the army of Crook. And so he field tested this new strategy at the Battle of the Rosebud a week before the Little Bighorn, but at the Little Bighorn, the same strategy worked. And so he was competing with the American army more in a sort of traditional white battlefield way, more than had been the case for most of the history of the Indian Wars. Would you accept that, Larry?
I would accept that.
All right, let's move on.
Let's move on.
Another reason why this is so interesting is the place. And how many of you have been to the battlefield at the Little Bighorn? It is one of the, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's not, many battlefields are in urban places or have been heavily built up or for whatever reason have been compromised from a spirit of place point of view. But if you ever go out to the Little Bighorn battle site, it's not that different in the 21st century from it was in the 19th century. And you can, my mother goes there all the time with me, and she always says that she could feel something in the grass. There's something there. There are ghosts there, or there's some kind of energy there. The place, the battlefield itself, has its own eerie kind of Twilight Zone feel to it, even in the 21st century. And it's been marvelously preserved and very lightly interpreted, so that we haven't let the National Park Service get in the way of the story by building up too much. And there's a feeling out there that makes it unique. Now, you get some of the same feeling at some Civil War battlefields, but most of the Indian Wars took place in Minnesota or Ohio or Indiana and so on, and those places have been effectively obliterated from a spirit of place point of view. So that would be another reason, I think, for the mystique. So now we have the total debacle, the centennial, Elizabeth Bacon Custer's advocacy, the Lakota mystique, particularly Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and the place itself. Can you think of any other reasons for this?
I'm just delighted the PowerPoint.
That's it. That's all you've got. Well, now go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So does anyone dispute any of that or want to take it in some other direction on why this is so fascinating to people?
And that's the issue right now, is we're just trying to understand why it is so fascinating to people. And so we promised ourselves that at 35 minutes in, we were going to stop for a second and take comments from folks that might be able to add to this thing about why the Custer mystique and why there's so much interest in this. And we've got a microphone back here. We ask you to use the microphone so that you get picked up by the taping that's going on. Robin's got a microphone. Do we have any comments? Tracy, you got a comment you want to make for us?
Well, she'll bring the mic down.
She'll bring the mic down to you. You've been called on.
Well, since I've been called on, I have too many comments to make because you guys have been talking and you haven't made any mistakes. It's all accurate information. I must say, Crook's column is an interesting one to me because my great-grandfather, an Irish immigrant, Michael McGann, won the Medal of Honor at the Battle of the Rosebud with Crook's column. And you're exactly right that this is part of the lack of information that Custer had about the change in tactics by the Lakota peoples, and the fact that was the year, they say, I think it's Utley that talks about this, how that was the year that the reservations emptied. Young men realizing this might be the last chance to win their warriors, spurs, and another piece of information that didn't get to Custer. So he had no idea how big this camp was, and he had no idea that the tactics had changed. But I'm a European style historian. I'm more inclined to agree that this is really fairly insignificant in terms of our history. The Indian people were not going to be allowed to retain, their freedom on the plains. This was a military occupation, and it was going to proceed. If there was one man that was important to this, it wasn't George Custer, it was Grant, who could have vetoed the act requiring all the Lakota to go back to the reservations, but he didn't. And so Custer was just a soldier following his duties. He was certainly a remarkable Civil War hero. I think he did have an influence on the victory in the Civil War because he was the kind of general that Sherman and Sheridan and Grant needed, somebody who would not just send men into battle, but lead them into battle. And so you're right, he's a significant character. He certainly understood that public relations. He was a self-promoter, arrogant, pompous, but very successful in battle. And so he becomes critical to this. He is important to it. But I really think in the end, you've touched on it when you say it's the massacre, it's the last stand, it's the fact that people were able to speculate over what takes place here. The marketing phrase, the perception is the reality. And so it becomes important because we believe it's important, because we're fascinated with it. That's the importance, and it allows us to study new ways to conduct history. But, George Custer really, in the end, is a fascinating character, but not as significant as were he one of the real policymakers.
Yeah, let me just pick up on a couple of things there before we go on. One, I thought that was brilliant by what Tracy just said, but
particularly the part that we hadn't gotten anything wrong so far.
No, not that.
Oh,
but the fact that Custer didn't know how many Indians there were, because there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the agents on the reservations were miscounting. They were deliberately miscounting because they got annuities and rations and per diems for each of the people who was actually in residence on the reservations. And so they systematically overcounted the number of people who were in residence. But that spring, thousands of Native Americans of the larger Sioux Nation and the Cheyennes were emptying out of the reservations, out of the agencies, and going out into Montana. They were doing it for a couple of reasons. One is there was a sense that the showdown was coming, but also there was this sense that the Indians knew that their time was ending. They knew that they were going to lose this battle for the occupation of the American West. And there's a sense of, we got to get out there and have these experiences before they're gone forever. There was a sort of one last glorious year kind of feeling amongst the native peoples, amongst the Sioux and the Cheyenne, to get out there. And so when Custer came in, when he came into the battle, his mind was doing two things. One was he didn't know how many people were there. And he dramatically underestimated the number of warriors and lodges that were on the west bank of the Little Bighorn. But secondly, the rule was Indians always scatter and won't fight. That his biggest fear, as you know, was that he was going to get there and the Indians would scatter, and he wouldn't know which of the 20 or 30 paths to follow, and there would be no battle. And so that instead of waiting long enough to do the recon that might have given him a better sense of how to go about facing a much superior force, he rushed because he was so frightened. He was obsessed with the fact that they were going to get away from him and he was going to lose his chance. And so those things are things he couldn't know going into the battle.
And just to bounce off of what Tracy and Clay were saying, the map that is now up there, just to show you that Red Cloud's war is 1866 to 1868, and what Red Cloud is doing is fighting because there's forts on what's called the Bozeman's Trail, which is going up into Montana, and he wants those forts closed down, and he wins. And he ends up with a treaty in 1868, and it creates what's called the Great Sioux Reservation, and you can see that is virtually everything west of the Missouri River in South Dakota. And what's going on when Tracy said the reservation is emptying out, and what Clay just described, is that as part of that treaty in 1868, the area in Wyoming and Montana that you see labeled up there as unceded hunting grounds meant that the Indians could still go into that area. That wouldn't be part of the reservation, but they could still go into that area and do their hunting. And so that is what's going on, and exactly what Clay was saying, and the count is not accurate. So thousands of Indians are leaving the Great Sioux Reservation and are now gathering out in Montana.
As they have a legal right to do under this treaty.
Under the treaty. They're into the unceded hunting grounds. But what the United States government does is decides that the Indians must go back to the reservation and gives them a deadline. Now think about this. This is January right now we're in. And all the Indians had to be back on the Great Sioux Reservation by the end of January 1876, or they would be considered hostiles. And the United States Army would then come and forcibly move them back to the reservation. That's what's laying the whole groundwork for this. So I just wanted to hit on those. We've got some other questions, but just what Tracy and Clay were talking about, this map hopefully kind of puts that in the right perspective. And sir, you've got a comment.
Yes, I'm a enlisted, ex-enlisted man. I was an enlisted man during the Vietnam War, and I did read some of the things that about Custer, and I saw movie depictions of him, and he wasn't the kind of guy that I think that I would have liked to serve under very badly. What did the common soldier think of Custer?
Well, there were many different attitudes towards Custer by the people that he worked with, but they tended to polarize. A small number of people, particularly those immediately in the 7th Cavalry, adored Custer and worshipped him almost, but that was a very small number. A much larger number of people thought that he was irresponsible, self-aggrandizing, arrogant, too hard on his men, prone to erratic activity. People grumble, and he had famous enemies, and the most famous of all of his enemies was Frederick Benteen, who was at this battle, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and one of the survivors. But it's fair to say, wouldn't it be, Larry, that that this was not a universally loved commander. That Custer had many enemies in his own lifetime before all of this happened.
Yeah.
Because of the way he drove his men, his acts of discipline were sometimes arbitrary and excessive. He frequently failed to tell his immediate inferiors of his plans. He wouldn't announce what his strategy was for a battle. He would just go in and they would be expected to somehow intuit what he had in mind. And then his very wild personal behavior when not in battle offended many people, but especially Frederick Benteen.
Just quick things to add there. First, thank you for your service during the war. We appreciate that. Secondly is that as a soldier, you can appreciate that during the Civil War, Custer was a cavalry officer and had in ratios the largest losses of any other cavalry commander. He attacked and attacked and attacked, and he lived off what was called Custer luck. And the guys that rode with him, they wore the red bandanas, and they were very proud to be part of Custer's unit. So it's an amazing thing, but at the same time, I would say that he was, I would agree, a very harsh. Wasn't he at one time, maybe Tracy can help me, or I see Kermit back there, at one point he was flogging soldiers in Texas, wasn't it? Kermit saying yes.
Even though the Army had suspended
it was
outlawed in 1861.
Yeah, it was outlawed, and yet he was still flogging, having soldiers flogged in a campaign in Texas. And so, not a likable guy. I would agree with that.
But there were many unlikable people in the Army. I mean, we need to be careful not to demonize Custer. He was. There are two types of generals, in my opinion. There are get-her-done generals who are understated, like George Crook, wore sloppy clothes, didn't call attention to himself, wasn't flamboyant. His view was, there's a dirty job to do, I know how to do it, I'll go do it. And there are many such commanders in history. George Marshall was one in World War II. U.S. Grant was one. People who just realized that war is a grim and awful business, and you need to do it as ruthlessly and efficiently as you can, but there's no need to create the cult of the officer. And that's one distinguished approach to commanding. Another one is the self-aggrandizing, self-dramatic, over-the-top, Patton-like person, and we have a bunch of those in our history. Custer is one of them. Patton is one from World War II. MacArthur in Korea. I mean, this is a second brand, and Custer definitely belongs to the self-dramatizing approach to leadership, which had a dual effect. It really offended a lot of people, like Benteen and Reno and others, but it also created a cult, a charismatic cult of Custer for those who found him fascinating. And he was found fascinating by really three types of people. Some of his other officers and enlisted men, intense loyalty amongst a kind of a core. Women found Custer just overwhelmingly fascinating, charismatic, and sexually alluring. And he was the darling of the press, of newspapers that wanted to play on the sensational qualities of this person. He wasn't just a cipher. He was a dashing figure who could easily be put on the cover of Harper's Magazine or could be written up in the New York Herald Tribune because he brought colorfulness to what he did. So that doesn't make him fundamentally different from other leaders.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm the Widow Buxton, 7th Cavalry, Company E. I think one of the main points that everybody is alluding to is the fact that he was a character. And he always marched to his own drum. He did his own thing. A lot of people would like to be like that and do that, but he did whatever he wanted to do regardless. And I'm a Civil and Indian War reenactor and have been for 20 years, and it seems like my husband, who was anal about all this, being a cavalryman, you either loved him or hated him, the way I understand it. And he was such a horse person that he could ride long periods of time, and I think he rode in a particular way, and they called him Iron Butt or something like that. And I think that they said that he thought more of the game that he killed and put that in ambulances and stuff, and at some of the men who might have been wounded and thing, they marched along, and he put his trophies and stuff in the ambulance, but you either loved him or hated him. But I think the fact that he marched to his own drummer regardless of the rules is what really makes him fascinating too, and you've all alluded to that.
Yeah, fair enough. There's some thoughts over here and here.
Getting back to your original point about what makes this battle so intriguing, it's been my experience in the past 35 years that everybody I talk to, what it boils down to is reading over your guys' resumes, pretty impressive. Went to Oxford, degrees all over the place. But a little guy like me with an AA from BSC,
All right.
nobody came back from this battle. And for the longest time, historians have just been, they just kind of cast off what the Native Americans had to say about the battle. They're only recently starting to put that all together. But I can make my interpretation of that battle. You can make your interpretation, and yours is no better than mine. And it's the great equalizer. I think that helps quite a bit.
That's a good point.
And also, Custer had a lot of enemies, because if you look at that post-Civil War army, they reduced from 1 million men down to 25,000, and you had an egotistical free-for-all going on. There was first sergeants that were brigadier generals in the Civil War, so you had a lot of egotistical stuff going on.
Okay, we've got another one back here if we can, Robin. While she's walking back there, first, do you belong to the Alumni Association?
Larry.
We ought to get you in the Alumni Association. Sir.
Clay, you seem to be trying to balance the view of Custer as a leader, and I appreciate that. But I think when you have someone who marches to the beat of their own drummer, that's fine and that is alluring. But when you have other men's lives in your hands, as Custer did throughout his career, and you have a general that has the highest losses in the Civil War, percentage-wise, and you have someone that, upon return to the 7th at some point, had the horses in the cavalry reassigned by color, so that this company would have all white horses, and this company would have all black horses, and this company would have all roan horses, because, geez, that sure looked great. Taking away from a cavalry soldier his horse that he had a personal relationship with for the benefit of how this looked as a public relations exercise, that's all well and good if you're a politician or you're a CEO, but when you are leading men whose lives are in your hands, I think that maybe cuts a little bit towards the idea of Custer as a leader maybe being a little bit less than the ideal. Now I'm trying to balance maybe what I'm trying to say a little bit. But I don't think you can say that that the men who served under him probably thought the world of him. Now, the folks that were close to him in the 7th, I think that's true. But of course, there was a gang of enforcers, many of whom were related by blood to Custer, including his brother, in that immediate group that enforced that sort of brotherhood with an iron fist. Some of that came with blood, not just with admiration. So that's what I would say.
Well, let me just, I'd like to respond to that, and I'd like you to, Larry, also. I take your point, and I'm not that it matters. I mean, what we're trying to do today is to really examine Custer from a humanities perspective, but my own personal feeling has changed, and I'll bet it's no different from Tracy's and a lot of other people's. You know, when you first hear about Custer when you're a child, you're fascinated because of the total wipeout, and it's a mystery. We don't know exactly what happened, and we never probably can fully. And then you go through, because most of the people in this room lived through the 60s, there was this period of linking the Indian Wars to our colonial activities in Vietnam, and there was a profound disillusionment with the white occupation of the American West. A lot of us, I certainly was one of them, had it as a life-changing experience to read Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. That book deeply influenced us, and we became Custer attackers, Custer antagonists, and then Custer was seen as this megalomaniacal, self-aggrandizing man who took perfectly innocent people and got them killed because he was a nitwit, or he was a genocidal fool, or whatever you want to say. Same thing as he was portrayed in the film Little Big Man. But then at a certain point, you go through that phase of Custer, early fascination and enamorment followed by profound disillusionment. And then at some point you come out of that, and I think you create a more balanced view of him. And I think that that's happened not only to me and to you and to Tracy and many others, but it's part of the country's changing views of the thing. And so today, to follow up on a point already made, for the first time we take the Native American point of view much more seriously. And we have a number of books. James Welch's book, Killing Custer, which is a really interesting sort of postmodern account of this, or our own David Humphreys Miller's oral accounts of oral histories, or Marcus Marquis's book on Wooden Leg. So today we incorporate Indian points of view much more than we did, and we're achieving a more balanced, more multicultural view of the Indian wars and of the battle, don't you think, Larry?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we have at least 3 or 4 times in just this quick conversation here, Vietnam came up. And I think that, as you just talked about, our changing view of Custer and probably all the Indian wars, if you will. Obviously, immediately, Custer was representing the United States. He was fighting in the Indian Wars. There's a lot of talk about clash of cultures, and that's why it becomes a last stand. There's a wonderful book Philbrick has just written. He talks about it's 2 last stands. It's the last stand of Custer, and it's the last stand of the Lakota. The last stand of the Plains Indians, and so it's really 2 last stands. But at any rate, you take that, and then we go through a time in the United States here where we talk about sort of consensus history, that as we are approaching World War II, we are not critical of what's happened in the United States and how we view those things. But Vietnam changes all of that. And I think, when you take a look at Errol Flynn and They Died with Their Boots On, that talks about Custer as this great American hero, and then you take Little Big Man that shows Custer as this raving maniac out on the hill. That's how our society has changed in its view of Custer, I think, and probably all the Indian wars. But Vietnam War has a tremendous impact on our view of George Armstrong Custer.
As long as we're talking about this, can you just give your assessment of Custer? Where do you see him on this spectrum? If at one end, here's this profoundly narcissistic person who cost the lives of a lot of other people. And on the other hand, there is this man of his time who was doing a job well for the United States government.
I would say both those are correct. I think he was a narcissist. I think that he did take incredible risks. I think that he did lose a lot of men that he probably didn't have to lose. That I don't know. That's pure speculation. But I also believe that at the Little Bighorn, he did exactly what we would have expected him to do. He divided his forces. People criticized him for that. He'd done it before. He was concerned about the Indians leaving as opposed to fighting, and the change in tactics that Tracy was talking about. So I think he can be all of those. I think he can be the narcissistic, flamboyant, wouldn't be a very nice guy, I think the gentleman said. I don't know that I would want to sit and have dinner with George Armstrong Custer. I don't know that I would like him very much as an individual. But at the other hand, when he's out there and he's making decisions, the immediate decisions with the information that he had that wasn't very good. This is pre-satellites, and one of the things we talked about is what would have made a difference. Well, some satellite photographs would have made a great difference in the Little Bighorn.
Or cell phones.
Or cell phones, communication devices. So I think he would be both of those. Let's see if there's any other comments out here.
There's one right here.
There's one right down here.
You called him, when we first started, you called him a jerk.
I did.
And
I stand by that.
That's your view?
I think he probably was.
My question or my comment's a little off of the Custer thing, but I find it very interesting that you were sort of criticizing his lack of developing a response to the changing tactics. Remember when Anthony Wayne and the British first came in during our Revolutionary War, the British marched in front of the Indians in a big flank and let everybody shoot them and kill them. They learned from the Native Americans how to fight differently. 100 years later, it's an interesting turnaround.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Clay needs to tell the story about woman who was Libby Custer, an actor, when she was asked what...
Oh, well, yeah, it's not a very interesting story, actually.
It is an interesting story.
In my own history as a reenactor, I've never portrayed Custer and have never been interested in Custer. I think George Crook is a much, much more interesting person than say, Custer. But I worked with a woman who portrayed, some of you may have seen her. Her name is Helen Stauffer, and she performed here at Fort Abraham Lincoln many, many years ago as Elizabeth Custer. And she was just a marvelous Elizabeth Custer. And Elizabeth Custer was a great writer herself. She wrote a number of books, more than her husband, Boots and Saddles and Tenting on the Plains, and those books are terrific reads. And by the way, so is his book. His book, My Life on the Plains, is, I think, a very good book and outstanding when he's describing the plains landscapes. Anyway, but this woman was actually the biographer of Mari Sandoz, who is a famous novelist and wrote a famous book about Crazy Horse. And so she's portraying Elizabeth Custer. And so when we would have this Chautauqua, the audience would ask her all these questions. And I was the moderator, and my last question every night was always the same question. Mrs. Custer, to the best of your knowledge, what happened out there in Montana? And Helen Stauffer's answer was always the same: too many Indians. Which, of course, is true, but if Custer had had satellite photos, if he had had adequate recon, remember they rushed the battle because they felt that the word had already gotten to the Sioux and Cheyenne that they were there. If he had been able to wait for 24 hours and rest his men who were exhausted and rest their horses and send scouts up to look and actually get a view of the village, which they couldn't see from the hills that they were looking from, he might have done something different. He might not have split his command in the way that he did. He might have waited for Gibbon and Terry to come up. Even if he fought the battle, he would have fought it differently, because so far as we can tell, and we're getting into mystery land now, but all he saw was the Cheyenne village, which was the north village, the only one that was visible from the bluffs that he was looking at, and he probably radically underestimated the number of native peoples that he was going to face. And so if he'd had adequate recon, he probably wouldn't have just charged mindlessly into the village. He would have thought through a better strategy, presumably. But he didn't have that. There was no way that Reno could contact him. There was no way that Benteen or that Crook, after his setback at the Rosebud a week earlier, Crook made no effort that we know of to get the news to any of the other officers that the Indians were huge in numbers and much better organized in their tactics than ever before. That's one of the mysteries, why Crook didn't make a bona fide effort either to get back into the field or to get news to the others that this was a much bigger problem than they had anticipated in the spring. So we don't know, but her answer was the right answer.
It's the right answer.
That there were 12,000 Indians or more in that site, and Custer expected there to be 2,000 or 3,000, and of that, about half of them warriors.
Most authors will say that at the Little Bighorn was the largest encampment ever of Plains Indians at one location, maybe 12,000, probably 3,000 warriors. So there's absolutely no doubt that this, that Custer was riding into something, as we've already talked about, he had no idea, but it was far, far massive than he could have ever anticipated, and no one could have anticipated at that time. But I do think it's really important to also give credit to the fact that he was outgunned and he was outfought that day.
Oh, General. Yeah.
Pardon me?
The Crazy Horse really fought a smarter battle.
Smart tactics, and Custer's men are all, the rifles are 45-70s. They are breech load, single shot, very accurate long distance, but they're very unreliable once they heat up because it's very hard to eject the shells. And the Army had decided that it would keep the 45-70 breech load, meaning that the top flips up. I wish I had a picture of one, but the top flips up, and then that ejects the shell. But after the barrel gets hot, the shells expand inside, and now you flip it up, and the shell doesn't expand, and you've got your knife out, and you're digging out the casing so you can put another round in to fire off another shot. Well, the adversaries that day that Custer's men were going against, well, they've got these single-shot 45-70s. Many had repeating rifles. Repeating rifles are fairly new on the landscape. They were first seen actually down by Sheridan. I think it's called the Wagon Box fight in about 66. I might be wrong about that. The first time that repeating rifles were used, and actually at that time it was used by the white woodcutters that were using against the native warriors. But nevertheless, when we get at the Little Bighorn, now we've got tremendous numbers. Number one, huge numbers of native fighters. Many of them with repeating rifles, so that they're just shooting into the crowd and repeating their rifle and shooting and repeat and shoot while the soldiers are trying to dig out their casings and that single shot that they've got. So we've got that. And then we've got the tactics on top of it. So instead of everybody running off, like Custer, you talked about what he feared was going to happen, instead of running off, they're actually meeting them. They're actually doing maneuvers, and they're coming around, and hopefully we'll get into the battle here in a little bit. I got some great pictures of this. Yeah, huh? So,
well, where are we here?
Okay. Where are we here?
Let's step back.
Did we have some other? We got a comment in back.
All right, let's do that. Yeah. Then let's step back to the 1874.
Okay.
I don't think we can underestimate the mystique of the man. There's an organization called Little Bighorn Associates that exists in the world of 1,000+ members. And they're dedicated to the preservation of the memory of George Armstrong Custer. And they're an interesting group. They've been to Bismarck several times, and Kermit was involved, and I was involved in them. These are people, this is an international organization from all over the world that people study Custer. And those who get involved in Custer's life sometimes, I think, go too far. Well, one story, and Tracy would know this, one of the gentlemen who plays Custer a lot at the Post is Steve. And he's been back many times, and we were having the Little Bighorn Associates meeting in Bismarck, and the general and I were hanging out late, and we decided to get something to eat, so we went across to the East 40 for a drink, and we sat down, and he was in his full regalia, which caused some interesting comments in the bar. We sat down, and we were going to have, I thought I'd have a martini, and I said, what would you like, sir? And he said, you know, of course, sir, that I'm a teetotaler. Yeah. There's Elvis impersonators who think they're Elvis, and there are those who think they're Custer. So I don't think you can underestimate the mystique of the man, both left and right, at all.
Yeah.
That's not on there. Can you make it?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to step back for just a moment, and then we will move on.
And we're just going to remind you how this all happened. When we decided on this year's set of lectures, so we brought up the word Custer, and I'm sure you're sorry we did now, but one of the things I wanted to talk about was his footprint in North Dakota. And we're so lucky that we have Fort Abraham Lincoln here, and the Custer House has been recreated. It's a marvelous facility. I'm sure most of you or all of you have been out to see it. We have Tracy Potter, who is dedicated to a careful, full examination, not only of Custer, but of the culture that lived there, the on a slant Mandan villages that were there in the century before Custer. And so we North Dakotans are fortunate in that we have the location from which all of this began. But it wasn't just the 1876 foray into Montana. And if you recall, when Jim Fugly was the state travel director, he had that sign up on the Montana border that said Custer was fine when he left, sort of reminding us that there had been that there's a North Dakota element to this story. But there's more to it, Larry. First of all, Custer was here for a couple of years. The house bears the stamp of the Custers. It burned down, is it February 8th, 1874? Burns down, and it's rebuilt. And it's rebuilt a little bit with a few extras that were added because of the request of the Custers. And so you have this very distinctive house that they lived in. You have the fort. In 1873, he accompanied the survey party led by, I think it's Lieutenant Colonel Stanley, that followed the route that would become the NP's route along the Yellowstone. So he was a military escort for railroad engineers that were laying out the route that the NP would take through Montana along the Yellowstone. That's a very interesting story in the world of Custer. We don't have time to go into it today, but he after that, there were a couple of little battles that occurred, with the Lakota out in Montana in 1873, and he became a national figure in the press and was called the Darling Custer and so on for his heroics on that journey. Then in 1874, much more to the point for this story, Custer was assigned to lead 1,000 men and over 100 wagons from Fort Abraham Lincoln to the Black Hills. And the journey began on July 2nd, 1874, and he was back at Fort Lincoln on August 30th, 1874. In that journey, he not only produced a superb report of the Black Hills, including geologically, but he took along 2 photographers, 3 newspapermen, even though he had been told not to do so, 2 miners, and a geologist. And in early August of 1874, his miners and geologists discovered gold in the Black Hills. And there had been rumors floating around for decades that there was gold in the Black Hills. Father de Smet, the famous Jesuit who came up and down the river many, many times and was a friend to Sitting Bull, had heard stories and had circulated stories about gold in the Black Hills. And so there's a lot of anticipation that there's gold there. But it was part of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty that this was Sioux country, Lakota country. And in 1868, this is reconfirmed in a much more emphatic way, that this is definitely Lakota country, that white people are not permitted without special licenses to go into that country, and this is not negotiable. This wasn't the unceded territory in Wyoming. This was the heart of the Lakota world, guaranteed by a treaty entered into by the United States government. And when we entered into that treaty in the wake of the Bozeman Trail War, Red Cloud's War, we made a foolish concession, the white people did. The concession was that if any further land cessions would occur in the Lakota world, 3/4 of all adult males of the Lakota people would have to sign those treaties. Now, if you just think about that for a minute, even getting 3/4 of the Lakota into one place would be virtually impossible. But 3/4 is effectively unanimous. It would be almost impossible to get 3/4 on any vote in the North Dakota State Legislature or the United States government. And so it's as if the United States deliberately created an impossible paradox for itself by saying, this is the final settlement of the Sioux country. We will never be back for more. And if we did come back for more, there would have to be effective unanimity amongst your tribe before you could ever be required or be talked into ceding more land. So that's the background of this. In the midst of this, Custer is sent in 1874 to do an examination of the Black Hills. He discovers gold thanks to carrying these geologists and miners, and it was a bona fide discovery. It wasn't a fake. But he then sends Lonesome Charlie Reynolds, one of his favorite scouts, a white man, on a nocturnal journey over 4 nights from the Black Hills to Fort Laramie with the news that gold has been discovered in the Black Hills. And that news is telegraphed out, and it creates a national mania, another gold rush, that comes right in the midst of an economic downturn at least as severe as the one we've been going through for the past 2 years. In 1873, there's a national financial collapse. The House of Jay Cooke collapses. The NP Railroad gets stuck on the East Bank at Bismarck, and the country is in a state of genuine economic panic, and suddenly Custer is able to declare to the country that there is a new source of unlimited wealth in this relatively unknown mountain region called the Black Hills of South Dakota. And so there's a lot of talk amongst historians about what are the dynamics behind Custer's visit. But he clearly wasn't there as a purely neutral observer of Western landscapes. He was there on behalf of what we would call the industrial military complex, I suppose. And his discovery of gold was not allowed to wait until he got back to Fort Lincoln. He rushed the news out by sending Lonesome Charlie Reynolds on these night journeys across to Fort Laramie. And this this was the flashpoint that led inevitably to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Because in order to secure the Black Hills for white prospectors, and there was no way to stop it, the United States government now had to break the Treaty of 1868, in spite of all of the sacred promises made then, And there was a secret meeting in the White House in November 3rd, 1875, in which President Grant said, we'll order the hostiles back to the agencies, and if they don't go, we'll authorize a military campaign to either wipe them out or force them back. And so now we are in direct, overt, purposeful violation of the Treaty of 1868. And the Sioux, the Lakota, and the Cheyenne decided that they were going to demand that the government adhere to the treaty, including by defending themselves if necessary. And it was on that set of military campaigns that Custer found himself at the Little Bighorn. And so you can't understand this story unless you realize the importance of the Treaty of 1868 and the fact that the United States government violated it. And even today, when I was, some of you will remember, in 1973, there was a case in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in federal court about the Black Hills, and the United States government was trying finally to pay off the Sioux and the Cheyenne for the stealing of the Black Hills, and this had been authorized by a congressional action in 1930. The Lakota and the Cheyenne refused to accept the financial settlement, and they said, no matter what money you put in the pot, we are not accepting a settlement. We are accepting nothing less than the return of the Black Hills, so the case is still unresolved in federal courts.
And interesting, back to the issue where I said we sometimes think about this stuff as ancient history. That treaty is an 1868 treaty, violations occurring in 1874 and forward, and it's still relevant today.
It's still being adjudicated.
Still being adjudicated today. This is not a resolved issue, the ownership of the Black Hills.
So just quickly, I just wanted to show for people that are fascinated, what's the footprint of Custer in North Dakota? Well, there's that 1873 foray on the Yellowstone, the 1874 one, which is shown here, and then 1876. This is the route. I don't have a pointer, but you can see Fort Abraham Lincoln. And on the way down, he went down to Carson and that area, and down along the Grand near Hettinger, and then into the Black Hills. He actually entered the Black Hills from the west. He went to Indian Cara in Wyoming first, and then penetrated the hills, spent some time there, discovers gold in early August, and then he made his way back up, and he arrives back at Fort Abraham Lincoln on the 30th of August.
I got it.
I did not know this until this weekend, and I'm just utterly fascinated by this. Maybe some of you know this. This is a painting by Remington, and it's a painting of Young Man's Butte. You know where Young Man's Butte is? It's near Richardson. Custer camped there on this journey. He camped there several times, but on this journey in 1874, he camped 1 mile west of Young Man's Butte. And this painting by Remington is of a Crow Indian on top of Young Man's Butte. And the story is, and it's in this book, Following Custer, but it's told by Rain in the Face, but this is a Crow individual who's surrounded by Lakota. You see the Lakota down below. He can't escape. They're going to kill him. And so he gets up on this butte, and he does a death dance and a death song. And then he took out his knife, and he killed his pony, and then he killed himself. And the Lakota were so impressed by this act of bravery that they buried him with honor on top of Young Man's Butte, and then named it Young Man's Butte for this act of heroism. And this is a famous Remington painting that's at the Ammon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. But I did not know that it was of this scene, but this is the place where that occurred, right next to Richardson. Isn't that fascinating?
I got it.
This is the route down through Flasher and Carson and so on the way out. Here's the way, and this is the route on the way back. On the way down, they went along the Cannonball, the Cedar, and the Grand to get out of North Dakota. On the way back, they came up along the Little Missouri. And you see them on August 20 and 21st, south of Marmarth on the river. You see them then coming up on August 22nd to a few miles. This would be in near Bullion Butte. Again, near Bullion Butte on August 23rd, and then they're up near Belfield on August 24th. The Lakota to this day call this the Thieves' Road. The route along the eastern side of the Little Missouri into the Black Hills is known as the Thieves' Road because of the they believe that Custer was deliberately sent as an agent to provoke a struggle over the Black Hills, and they therefore have commemorated this route, particularly the one along the east bank of the Little Missouri, as the Thieves' Road. So there it is. If you just go forward one more. This is his map. This was a formal United States reconnaissance survey, of sort of like the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they had trained cartographers with them. This is the same map, hard to read here, but that's it. This is a picture of Custer. His personal valet is standing up over his shoulder. On his right is Bloody Nose, his Arikara scout. Also shown here is Goose and one other scout, and then, of course, his ubiquitous dogs. Go to the next one, Larry. Look at this. This is 1874, but look at the tent. It's a Northern Pacific Railroad tent left over from the previous year when he was doing the escort along the Yellowstone, which just reminds us, I mean, we tend to forget this. We tend to look at this battle sort of as a romantic encounter on the plains of Montana, but he was really, in many respects, as our military was, an agent of the industrialization of the American West, and that tent is a leftover from the previous year. This is Bloody Nose. Bloody Knife, sorry. This is a famous picture of them, the train of over 100 wagons moving through a valley in the Black Hills. Here's the group photo. I just love this photo, Larry, for lots of different reasons. They had a photographer did a group photo. That in itself tells you a little bit about this story, but just go to the next slide. There's Custer on his side. He loves, maybe somebody here who knows Custer better than I do knows why. He loved to be photographed lounging when other people would be standing up or in some sort of a more standard military configuration. Custer loves to lounge, and here he is lounging in the Black Hills. Custer's not in this photo, but this tells you a little more about this. Here's a champagne party. That's almost certainly Fred Grant on the right, the son of the President of the United States. Custer's no idiot. He takes along the son of the President of the United States on this recon into the Black Hills. He shot his first grizzly bear there. Skeptics think it might have been a cinnamon, but he thought it was a grizzly. At any rate, these were stereopticons. This is a beautiful photograph, I think, of one of the things they noticed was that the flowers in the Black Hills were in bloom, and one day they counted 58 different varieties of wildflower in one meadow. And this is, you can see the wildflowers in the grass here. This is a beautiful picture. And then you see what happened, how the press, what's the date on this? August 12th? I can't see it, but it's in August. It's the same year, and already Harper's is publishing a front page story. This is the Life magazine of the time. This is the nation's premier popular magazine. Here are prospectors already in the Black Hills, just in the midst of this story. He isn't even back at Fort Lincoln yet, and already the national press is portraying the Black Hills as this place for the next gold rush. And here's an inside page from Harper's, engravings taken from photographs that had been done on the journey. So you get a sense of how immediate the country was willing to let this story burst and shatter any last hopes that the Treaty of 1868 would be observed.
Want to keep going on this one, or after the battle?
Just go forward, yeah, just to this next piece for a minute. Just to show you the reservation one more time. Go to next. Here's 1851. The great Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Mandan were there, Arikara were there, Hidatsa were there, Crow, Shoshone. This was one of the earliest major treaty sessions in the American West, and it was conducted just a little ways away from Fort Laramie, but this was really not designed to take land from Native peoples. It was designed to establish homelands and to get safe passage for exploring parties and immigrants. And so this is you see here, the Lakota world as defined by the Lakota themselves at the Treaty of 1851. All of western South Dakota, then a straight line down to intersect the North Platte, up the North Platte to near Fort Laramie. Then you go up, you see on the north, it goes up to the current headwaters of the Cannonball, the Cedar, the Heart, and the Grand Rivers. It leaves the Little Missouri out because the Little Missouri in the 1851 treaty belonged to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, and then it goes along a line of the Powder River. So it's an immense, at that time the United States was not interested in these lands yet, and so it was adjudicating different Indian claims to the west, and this gigantic zone was the Sioux world. Go to the next one. This is the 1868 treaty, and you see two things here. One is that what would later become the Great Sioux Reservation in South Dakota is shown there. You see that it's west of the Missouri River. It goes up to what's now Standing Rock in North Dakota. The end of the reservation proper was the South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana border. But then west of it, under Article 16, was unceded Indian territory where the Lakota and Cheyenne were allowed to hunt until the game was gone. And then they also had hunting grounds down through the Republican River Valley all the way to the North Platte. So this is the provision of the 1868 treaty. Next one. Here is this is now the Great Sioux Reservation, which you see includes all of western South Dakota. Next. Here's in 1877, after the Little Bighorn, the United States, without treaty, just set the boundaries for the Sioux essentially west of the Missouri River, but looked at the Black Hills with Lead and the Homestake Mine have been carved out of the Great Sioux Nation. So now the United States has done what it intended to do. It took the Black Hills but left essentially the rest of the reservation. Then in 1889, to create a transportation corridor through the Great Sioux Reservation, the United States government created the fractured reservation system that's still largely intact today, the Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud, and Crow Creek. So that's how things got from 1851, Larry, until the turn of the century. The only treaty in that period which was a bona fide legal treaty between the United States and the Lakota was 1868, and all the rest were unilateral actions by the United States government.
Okay, now we're going to take about 15 minutes here. Well, first, are there any other comments? Anybody out here want to make some comments?
There's one way over there.
We do. Phil's over here. All right. Phil will tell us some things. Welcome, Phil. Glad to have you here.
Good afternoon. Fast forward 135 years to today, there's been a lot of discussion among the indigenous people of this country, the Lakotas particularly, about what's happening to their culture and their language. And it's all part of this transition that populations and cultures go through. But what's emerging is the need for indigenous groups to come together and plan for the future. That was always done among the Lakota people. Knowing the transition with the Custer and everything else experience coming, oral history is now emerging that the reason why there was such a convergence wasn't about necessarily one last glorious hunt and one last whatever. It was bringing the Ochete Shikawe, the 7 council fires of the nation together. And it was for peaceful purposes to the extent that that many groups were coming together. The 1934 Name Reorganization Act established the tribes as we know them today. And so we talk in the 1800s as if they were tribes, they were really a large confederation. They were separate bands that came together. So the call went out according to oral history, and that is why so many came together, and it was just Custer's surprise that broke that up. A lot of tribal leaders are lamenting today that that opportunity to plan for the future, because we plan for the 7 generations with prayer and ceremony and deep thought. And so there's a big struggle today to try to capture that. And yet we're constantly reminded about open wounds such as the Black Hills. The federal government said, here's the money, take it or leave it, and right now it's approaching $750 million. And our young people, without having that sense of history, the sacrifices, the loss, are writing letters to the editors and saying, we want the money. And so, again, tribal people and tribal leadership is being challenged today. And at the same time, Homestake Mine moves out, and what's coming in? National Science Foundation funded projects to use the thousands and thousands of mine shafts for science. I don't think anybody would argue about that, but again, what's still left open is the question of the Black Hills, and continually they do not acknowledge that as a current, not only open wound, but a very legal, problematic challenge for the future. I think right now, in looking at the Custer experience, we have the Wounded Knee Memorial Ride. You gentlemen did a super job in your last presentation talking about Wounded Knee. There's a lot of things that are happening today. So in the context of, I think, why Custer found so many people today, even as we speak, there's groups trying to come together to do what Sitting Bull and others wanted to do. Now is the plan for the future, knowing the realities, knowing that the numbers were going against us, and basically how do we begin thinking ahead and putting our minds together. So I appreciate you bringing that forward to a 21st century context, but I'm just pleasantly surprised sitting in these meetings and hearing this oral history emerging, that what really happened at the Little Bighorn prior to Custer arrival was the effort to bring the Oceti-Sakowin, the people together one more time to plan for the future. Pilamro, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Phil. Appreciate that. Phil Baird's from UTTTC and also on the board of the Cowboy Hall of Fame, I believe. Is that correct? So thank you very much for your comments.
So now what?
What I'd like to do is take about 10 minutes.
Oh, here we go.
Clay does not want me to show these pictures. How many want to see the battle? Come on, hands up. Yeah, all right, see? Okay, they're with me.
You had to beg. Go ahead, yeah.
So, okay, we've talked about Custer and the flamboyance, and so we'll just, that's what it looked like in the Civil War. The reality is that this is probably what Custer looked like, except he didn't wear a beard that day. All these pictures show him with long flowing hair and dressed. He was in buckskins, and he had his hair cropped very, very short. This is actually a picture from about 68 after the Battle of Washita, but this is what Custer looked like at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We talked a little bit about this Red Cloud. Red Cloud is the one that got the Bozeman Trail forts closed, defeated the United States, went head-to-head, and I think it's an important point to make, went head-to-head with the United States, defeated the United States, and got them to close down those three forts. In exchange for that, the Great Sioux Reservation, but we know the story on that. This is a picture of Crazy Horse's shirt.
Maybe.
If somebody shows you a picture and says this is Crazy Horse, it's not. There's no known pictures of Crazy Horse at all. So maybe this is his shirt. But we've already alluded to the fact that he played an important part in that. Just a picture of Fort Laramie and the treaties, and I won't revisit that. This is the council there at Fort Laramie in 1868, in which the Great Sioux Reservation was established. This again shows you the Great Sioux Reservation as it was established in the unceded hunting grounds. The trip to the Black Hills that Clay did such a great job on. What impresses me in this is I never saw a John Ford movie in which the cavalry traveled in wagons. They were always on horseback, but this is how they actually traveled. It had to be very cumbersome, and champagne and tables, and had to be a very cumbersome.
They played baseball in the Black Hills. It was the first baseball game in the Black Hills. You had photographers, newspaper. This thing was a kind of an elaborate picnic. They only had one short encounter with Lakota people, 5 lodges in the Black Hills, and it was on the whole friendly.
The question is, are the Black Hills considered sacred, and therefore that's another issue. And I'll defer to the nodding head of Phil. And Phil is saying, yes, that is true.
And Sitting Bull said, also just before all of this. I mean, Sitting Bull was the spiritual, political mastermind of this. And he said, it's our pack. It's our food pack. It's not that we go there on a routine basis. We don't. But when we need food, in years of the harsh winters or prolonged droughts, or whenever we need a reserve, the Black Hills are our food pack, and there's no way we're ever giving it up. And so it was also economically important as a place for the Lakota and Cheyenne, but it was a place of great spiritual importance, as seen, say, in Black Elk Speaks.
Here's a picture. This is like ration day. You have to think, and boy, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy. You have to think about what the real high level, the high watermark of the Great Plains horse culture and the buffalo hunts, and there's a lot of romanticism that we tie to that. And as a result of all these treaties and what was going on and the pressures that were coming from the American industrial society that Clay described so well, we ended up with ration days like this where cattle would be brought in and the Indians were told to go kill the cattle and slaughter them. And so this is a far cry from riding on horseback and being involved in buffalo hunts. And as a result of that, some of that, and Phil certainly elaborated much better than I can on what was going on out of the Great Sioux Reservation, but one of the interpretations is that to recapture that culture, folks were leaving. And as Tracy said, the emptying of the reservation. So that's going on in 1875. And so now we've got a problem. Nobody knows how many of the Indians are off the reservation out in the unceded land, which they had the legal right to be there. They're out there, they're legally there. Clay already talked about the meeting to say, okay, we've got to get them back to the reservation. So from a military standpoint, it falls to Phil Sheridan. Phil Sheridan is the one that has to come up with a plan. Now, how are we going to get the Indians back onto the reservation? And we saw this map earlier, so he ends up with this three-prong attack. As you can see, you've got Crook coming from the south, Gibbons coming from Bozeman, and Terry Custer column leaving right here from, well, actually even from Mandan's side of the river. And then we've already talked about Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull is the spiritual leader of this great gathering that's going on. I'm going to whip through these real quickly. So we've got this going on. Custer is now on a scouting trip south of the Little Bighorn. And jump in here anytime you want to, Clay. So Custer is down at those mountains you see in the distance. And they're actually looking through field glasses that they had, trying to discern. The scouts are telling him there's a whole bunch of horses out there. And you can see them way off in the horizon. You can see these horses. Thousands and thousands of horses to support this large of an encampment, a village. Thousands of horses. And Custer doesn't see them right. He finally borrows some field glasses from one of the foreign officers that had a better pair. And he looks, and he thinks he discerns now the horses, and he thinks he sees a village. Custer's number one issue, as we've already indicated, is that the Indians are going to break camp and they're going to take off. And he's going to miss his opportunity to fight them. He has no knowledge about the Rosebud. He has no knowledge that Crook has already been turned back, the changing tactics that we've already talked about. If you can envision that ridge there, and these are only estimates, folks, the 12,000 Lakota and Cheyenne are encamped on the side that we're on with that ridge, which is on the other side of the Little Bighorn River. Way south of that, Custer is looking through, trying to see what's there. And he doesn't see it. He doesn't have a very clear picture because of this ridge. Everybody's hiding on that side of the ridge, or not hiding, but the scene is hidden on the other side of the ridge. But Custer decides that they've got to engage. So what he does is he divides his forces, and this is showing how the force gets divided. Benteen, he sends one direction. Reno is to attack. And Benteen's whole purpose, he has him swing out. Benteen's purpose is to block the escape, because now we're considering there's going to be an escape. So Benteen's job is to block the escape. Reno's job is to attack the village. And Custer says, I will support you. What he's going to do is, you can follow the blue line there, he's riding behind that ridge, and now he's going to attack the village. That's the ridge that he's on. The trees here are right along Little Bighorn. This is the area that Reno actually attacks on and immediately knows he's got a problem. They dismount. Keeping in mind that every fourth soldier is basically an ineffective because he's handling, I'm sure there's a technical term for this, but he's handling the horses. Pardon? The horse handler, technical term. The horse handler. So every fourth soldier is an ineffective because that fourth soldier is handling the horses. And so Reno, they dismount, they set up a skirmish line. It's along those trees. Okay, here we go. All right, to give you a sense, this skirmish line, if we could, you see the double fence posts there, the corner fence posts. If you kind of drew a straight line out there towards the trees, that's probably in the general area, give or take 100 yards, where there was the skirmish line that Reno set up. If you can see the trees way in the distant hill there, that's the location of Last Stand Hill in that area. So there's a considerable distance. And so Custer is riding on the back side of that ridge while Reno is attacking from the point that we're at here. What happens is Reno, immediately they go into the trees, they're fighting in the trees, it's very close quarter. Reno obviously is getting rather confused or frustrated. Reno orders everybody to dismount, he orders everybody to mount again, he orders everybody to dismount, orders them to mount again, and now they're going to take off and they're going to try to get out of the predicament they're in and get onto the hill. This is what they have to charge up. They've got to cross the river and they've got to get up this hill, and that's their point that's what they're going to try. It's not a smooth ride, and by now many of them are off their horses. Some of them are still on their horses, and the fighting is very close quarter. This is from winter count. This is the Indian participants actually drew pictures of what it was like in the close quarters, and you can see how close the battle is hand to hand as they're trying to get across the river to begin with, and then get up the encampment up the embankment to get on top of the hill. I know I'm going through this really fast, but this is the Reno-Benteen Hill. The white marker you can see, hopefully out in the middle there, that's where the hospital was set up. And it's actually sort of a natural depression there. And so Benteen joins up with Reno at this time, and Reno and Benteen set up in sort of a circular fashion at this area, and then the fighting goes on the rest of the day and into the night. In the meantime, Custer's on the back side of this ridge, and Custer's riding along, and at one point, Custer, the last view anybody sees of Custer is he rides to the top of the ridge, and he takes off his hat and he waves it. And Reno and his guys see him waving his hat. Now, I have no idea what is going through Custer's mind at that time. I'm convinced that at that point, Custer, for the first time, realizes the magnitude of the encampment that they're actually attacking. I think that's the first time he actually sees it. But I do believe that he's waving his hat to say exactly what he told Reno the last time he talked to him. He says, I will support you. And I believe Reno is letting him know, Custer's letting Reno know, you're in a pickle, I know that, and I'm going to support you. So now he's going to attack the encampment. And so this is Medicine Tail Coulee. They end up charging down Medicine Tail Coulee. Now the gentleman made a point here. Anybody can make this up from now on. Okay? There's basically 220 guys riding with Custer. They attack the village. And we'll see this very quickly here. None of them survive. But the Indian side of the story is incredibly important here, because we say there's no survivors of Custer last time. Yeah, there were. There were thousands of Indians that were participants in it. And they saw it. And so there's some marvelous records now on the Indian side of the story. This is the Little Bighorn. There's some speculation that Custer was killed by the time they hit the water, that he was already killed, and they took him back up to Last Stand Hill. There's others that he led the attack. No one knows. This is going back up the hill, just a few shots there. Okay, so now there's Last Stand Hill. You can see it. Now they're fighting their way back up the hill, and there's markers all along there. It used to be there were only white markers to recognize the soldiers that fell there. Now when you go there, there are red granite markers to mark where they know that Lakota warriors fell. So you can see all the markers as you're heading up towards Last Stand Hill. In the meantime, the fighting is incredibly close quarters. And working our way up Last Stand Hill. Well, now this is an important shot because what happens at the very end of it, to sort of end the battle, is Crazy Horse leads a movement that comes around Last Stand Hill and over the top. So you've got Custer and his brothers and his officers and his soldiers that are left in one group there on Last Stand Hill, and now Crazy Horse actually outmaneuvers him at that point.
Comes around the back.
Comes around the back. And that's where they say Custer fell and those that fell with him. And I think that's Mark Kellogg's. You've got the Bismarck Tribune today when you came in. Mark Kellogg was a Bismarck Tribune reporter, and they've marked where he was at. Now, we did all that. Of course, Anheuser-Busch came out with this world-famous picture of what Custer's last stand was like. I've always found it interesting because it looks like he's fighting Zulu warriors there. Obviously the guy that painted this picture had no idea what he was painting. We know, for example, Custer, none of them had sabers. They did not take their sabers into combat that day. And we know he didn't have his long hair. Okay.
They'd been left behind. The dogs had been. The question is about the dogs. He always
traveled with his dogs.
Dogs and raccoons and opossums, and he collected. He had a menagerie everywhere he went. He was a great hunter, and he also loved pets. But when he left the dogs back at the Yellowstone River before going on to the Little Bighorn. Can I just, as long as you're on the Bismarck Tribune, can I just stop for a minute? Or do you,
please,
you want to go back to your analysis of the battle?
No, I'm done.
You really?
Yeah, this is...
Too many Indians. But I want to make a really important point here, Larry, because it's one thing to say, oh, well, Custer is just an agent of his culture and blah, blah, blah. But it's not just that Fort Lincoln was here. Dakota played an important role in this whole thing. Dakota was heading towards statehood, and the capital was in South Dakota. And there was if you look at all the newspapers of Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and what's now North Dakota, there was a virtually unanimous set of statements made in 1873, 1874, 1875, and 1876. And it's not pretty to talk about, but I want to just quote a couple of passages. And there were one of two views. One view was, let's exterminate the Indians of the Great Plains, just flat out. We can't become a modern American Anglo-industrial civilization until we exterminate the Indians. And I'll read a couple of these. These are open calls for this. A slightly less awful attitude was, let's do what it takes to subdue them once and for all, even if that includes exterminating. And so the Bismarck Tribune is famous, of course, for this extra, but listen to this. This is June 17th. This is the Bismarck Tribune. This is God's country. He peopled it with red men and planted it with wild grasses and permitted the white man to gain a foothold here. And as the wild grasses disappear when the white clover gains a footing, so the Indians disappear before the advances of the white man. Humanitarians may weep for poor Low, for Indians, and tell the wrongs he has suffered, but he is passing away. Their prayers, their entreaties cannot change the law of nature, cannot arrest the causes which are carrying them to their ultimate destiny, extinction. The American people need the country the Indians now occupy. Many of our people are out of employment. The masses need some new excitement. The war is over, and the era of railroad building has been brought to a termination by the greed of capitalists and the folly of grangers, and the depression prevails on every hand. An Indian war would do no harm. It must come sooner or later. That's the Bismarck Tribune. Here is the Nebraska City Press. It calls, quote, to exterminate the whole fraternity of Redskins. The Montana Post, it is high time the sickly sentimentalism about humane treatment and conciliatory measures should be consigned to novel writers, and if the Indians continue their barbarities, exterminate them. Brigadier General Patrick Connor, they must be hunted like wolves. Sherman to the President of the United States, we must pursue the war to the point of extermination if possible. It's important for us not to think, oh, two sides contesting for a territory. It was the policy of the government of the United States, whipped up in a frenzy by local press in Dakota and on the Great Plains, to have a final reckoning with the Sioux and the Cheyenne and other recalcitrants. And that reckoning in the hands of the less crazy press was for vanquishing, and in the hands of the more crazy press, including the Bismarck Tribune, was for extermination. And so that's a part of our legacy that we have to own. It's not a pleasant part of our legacy, but it's really one of the problems with the Custer battle is that it becomes a source of fascination in and of itself, and we forget the larger dynamics that are behind it. And these dynamics do not put the early pioneers of Dakota Territory in a very good light, let's put it that way. Now, they had reasons to be upset and afraid and paranoid. That's not part of the problem. But the problem was that the national attitude towards this problem was arguably somewhat more humane and thoughtful than the local attitude out here in Dakota Territory.
Which was not unusual. Colorado, prior to the Sand Creek Massacre, the same sort of rhetoric was going on there relative to Black Kettle and his people.
But it's
the same.
And I'm not trying to excoriate white people. I'm merely saying we have to own this as part of our history, right. That we weren't just saying it's an unfortunate thing they'll have to be placed on reservations. That was a relatively humane part of the policy. It was much, much more violent in the hands of the local communities and the press at the time.
And the more you got into the frontier, the more that was prevalent, was my point. I mean, that was prevalent in Kansas, in Nebraska, Dakotas, Colorado. And yet, at the same time, this is a time of they were called Friends of the Indians on the East Coast that talked about education for Indians. And, that's a whole other story at a different time.
But Custer is actually in the center on this debate. Right. Custer not only is not a genocidal man, he was a ruthless fighter when he fought, but his sentiments were not genocidal. And he has a famous statement in My Life on the Plains in which he says, if I were an Indian, and that in alone, just having him say that is pretty interesting. If I were an Indian, he says, I would want to be a horse-riding, hunting, nomadic Indian like the Lakota and the Cheyenne. He had a deep admiration for the very people that he was helping to fight. And it's not for nothing that Stephen Ambrose wrote a book about two parallel warriors, Crazy Horse and Custer, because he saw them in many respects as the same sort of person, but living in different cultures.
Okay, that's an excellent summary. Are there any questions? We would really like to find out if there's any more questions. We got a microphone up here.
I don't know if either of you know Father Bill Sherman, historian of the prairie. You know him? Well, anyway, I was at one of his lectures, and he said that many of the forts that were set up in the Dakota Territory and in Montana and maybe even in Minnesota were there to protect the Indian from the encroachment of the white man. Do you find that to be true?
That's a hard case to sell. The question, well, maybe you all heard it, that the forts were established to protect the Indians from the white man.
Certainly some of that was, the forts were put next to trade, the military forts were often located next to trade forts to keep peace in the trade relations between whites and native peoples. So, they weren't just there as a hostile occupation force. They were purveyors of peace and peaceful trade sometimes.
Yeah, they were there, I guess you could say, as peacekeepers, but we did a very poor job of it in the United States. I think the Canadians did a much better job of it as far as establishing peace on the frontiers, if you will. There's a question right here.
I'm just going to comment on, Clay said the Custer battle. So many people refer to it as the Fetterman Massacre, the Custer Massacre, and so on and so forth. And the definition of a massacre is when the individuals killed can't defend themselves. A lot of times American Indian hasn't been given the credit for the war and what took place. And it was a battle, not a massacre.
And this has been, you know, in American literature, this has been an ongoing fight, if you will, intellectual fight about, in fact, what should it be called? Now, I think officially it's a battle of the Little Bighorn.
No, the Little Bighorn National Battlefield. Little
Bighorn National Battlefield. Before it was Custer's Last Stand, and, you know, so it's
but
gone
now,
through.
In 2003, a new interpretive complex was dedicated at the Little Bighorn Battlefield, and you and I were there last year. And it's quite remarkable. We have some pictures. We don't have time to show them, but it was done in a very tasteful way to commemorate the Native American participation in the events there, including Arikara Scouts and Crow Scouts. So it wasn't just hostiles. It was to commemorate Native American activity of every sort. And it was done in a way that blended beautifully into the landscape, but it was incredibly controversial. When this is the little, it's sort of it looks a little bit like an earth lodge without the cover on it, but it's a circle, and there are interpretive panels all the way around. But to the west, I believe we're pointing west, that's the Last Stand Hill, and they left this gap, which is called the Ghost Portal, I believe, left this gap so that when you're in the middle of the new interpretive place that's away from the headquarters, you can then look through this gap and see where the last stand of Custer or some of his troops actually occurred. It's a very beautiful thing. If you haven't seen it, you should go. But when this was dedicated, it was incredibly controversial because every time they changed the name of the place, every time they changed the interpretive approach, our own Gerard Baker played an important role in the multiculturalism at the Little Bighorn site. Yep.
Tracy, we're going to give you the last word.
Really, no kidding. Well, I just wanted to say that the Bismarck Tribune editorial positions are quite recognizable, even at this point.
Tracy,
changed too much, but yeah. To me, the significance of Custer is, and first I want to say, that we are extremely delighted that he lost that battle as spectacularly as he did, because that means an extra 20,000 visitors a year to Fort Abraham Lincoln, and this is clear, and that's one of the things that's important about him. The other one is that we use him. We use him to assign the guilt of a nation to this one individual, when in fact, of course, he's just a soldier who was doing precisely what his nation was asking him to do. But he's more important as a myth than he ever was as a man. And you brought these points up perfectly, Mr. Scogin, President Scogin, because this difference of him as the character in They Died with Their Boots On, Errol Flynn, and that crazy guy at Little Big Man, that's what the nation needed from George Custer at that time, and we've been doing this ever since Libby passed away.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well,
I want to say one last thing. I know you do too, but
no.
I mean, coming out of what Tracy just said, I mean, we talk about Custer's luck, but in a really wacky, ironic way, the luckiest thing that ever happened to Custer was that he got himself killed. Because if he had just been a successful Indian fighter like Crook or Nelson Miles, we would know him, but we wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, it was, as they said when Elvis died, great career move. He sold more records since his death than ever before. Great career move for Custer to die in this incredibly romantic way at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because it has rocketed him to become the #1 figure in this story of the conquest of the American West, a place that he does not deserve by any reasonable measure of the term. So I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted his luck to work out quite that way, but the fact that it did, if he were able to look down from some other high place now. He would be glad that this happened, that he was aggrandized in this. Just one last point. It's last stand in a number of ways, Larry. It's Custer's last stand. It effectively brings about the final conquest of the native peoples of the Great Plains. Crook and Miles and others go into a kind of hyperdrive after this, and within a year and a half, they have accomplished what Custer had set out to accomplish because of the enormous national outcry amongst white Americans to get this settled in the wake of that. But here's another point that really seems interesting about it. It's the fact that Custer was wiped out is important to white people, non-Indian people, because it, in some sense, takes some of the guilt out of our complex of what happened. You see that it's kind of a karmic event in the midst of this larger occupation, and the fact that this occurred to our group of 220 people gives non-Indians a sense that it takes a little of the edge of guilt and remorse away from that, and therefore it's dangerous. It's dangerous to say, well, look, a superior group of Indians with superior strategy and maybe better weapons wiped out this command. That's a footnote to a larger story of systematic subjugation, and we have to be really careful not to let ourselves cheer up because this debacle happened to Custer and 220 men.
And we could go on for another 2 hours if you wanted us to, but we won't. Thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate it very much.